Welcome to this edition of 10 Minutes of IBM Tech. My name is Michael Moore, and I'm an IBM Software Client Architect. In the previous session, we talked about creating microservices using the GameON game, deploying it locally, and extending the room that's part of that session. In this session, we're going to be talking about creating a Docker container, pushing it to the IBM Cloud registry, and making it available for us to then subsequently use and push out onto the IBM Kubernetes cluster service that we created earlier. So the first thing that we're going to do is go ahead and create a Docker container. And to do this, we're going to use the build image functions, and then we're also going to create the Docker container. So we'll do a build and a create. Once that's been done, we'll go in and create the IBM Cloud registry. We'll create the namespace in the registry. We'll then create the image in the registry, and then we'll look at the images that are in the registry. At the completion of this, we'll have the item in the registry, which subsequently then can be published, and then we'll do this in a separate session. So at this point, we're going to go into our Quick Start terminal, and we're in the room Java component that we have here. So we're in our repository that we have. And then what we're going to do is subsequently go through and build out the namespace in the pieces. So I've got a couple shortcuts that I have here. And when we look at the commands that we're doing, so the first thing is we're going to go ahead and build the image, and then we are going to deploy that image or create the build, and also creating the namespace. If I was to be running the application local, I would use the Docker command to build the local image itself. So I would do Docker build to build out the file. And looking at the Docker image file itself would give me some context to what's actually running within that. Once the Docker build is executed, I could do Docker create to create the actual container, which can then be published out. Because we're not running this locally, we're going to be pushing it directly into the cloud. What I'm going to start off with is actually creating the namespace. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use the bxcr command, which is the Bluemix container registry command. And we'll create a namespace. And I'll call it more cluster more. You'll notice that I need to be logged in. So in this case, I'm going to make sure that I'm logged in. My credentials must have expired, so I'll do bx login. It's going to sign me into my endpoint. Enter in my credentials. Now that I'm authenticated, I'm going to go into my particular organization I'm going to use, where my cluster exists. And you'll see that it's actually bound to the region, the user account, org, and space. At this point, I'm ready to go ahead and add in my namespace. So it's now created a namespace for me. So following my little cheat sheet that I have, the next piece that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go ahead and build the registry out with the app and the name tag that I have. The important piece to this that we need to make sure we take into account is that when you're doing this, notice the period that's here. The period is the relative space to where that you're at. So for me, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and change this namespace here to the one I just created. And I'm going to give the application a name. Now I can give it an app tag, and the app tag is going to kind of be the differentiator between this. So this is the first version I'm doing, so I'm going to call it V1. So what we've done is we've created a name in the container registry. Within the container registry, I'm now going to build out the application that is part of this and the actual image of it. And it's going to take it from the code that's relative to the path that I'm in this case, the sample room Java that I'm in. I'll hit enter, and it'll start the compiling of the code and creating the Docker daemon container on the container registry in the IBM Cloud. Depending upon your network connectivity, it could take a little bit of time as it transfers the files from your workstation up into the cloud, and then the other functions that it's doing with that. Because it is a self-sustaining component, all the classes and everything that's associated to the runtimes and the code that I'm using need to be within the container and be completely self-sufficient. Unlike some of the platforms that you may run into where you deploy the runtimes, these containers have to have all the bits that are necessary for it to function and operate completely. Now that it's complete, it does give me a security warning that it hasn't been scanned, but we'll take care of that later. At this point, I'm going to issue the command of dxcr images. So I'm going to look at the container registry images, and I'll see the images that are out there within my space. Because there's more than one user out there, I'll see all the spaces that are out there and all the pieces that are there. So in this case, I'll scroll through looking for mine within my space. And I see the more cluster more, and it was done 30 seconds ago. And at this point, it's actually doing a vulnerability scan of that image now that it's been uploaded. Now that we know the image is there, we're going to use the container service to actually go ahead and look at the cluster configuration on this. So we're going to use the bxcs cluster config. And the cluster that we have is the more clusters. So as I pulled that off, when you're deploying to your environment, one of the things that needs to be set up on a Windows machine is the environment variable of kubeconfig, and you'll see this here. When you do this and you run the cluster config, it downloads the configuration to your local workstation so it knows what cluster that you're actually binding to. Under most circumstances, if this is the first time you're doing it, you're going to have to go and define this command in the system environment variables. I've already done this by going and right-clicking on my computer, selecting properties, and going into the advanced settings. And when I do that, I get environment variables. I can change that system settings and by adding a new additional set parameter that I have there, and then have that come back. Now that I've already done that previously, and we're ready to go ahead and actually run the application and deploy the application. So I'll copy the next command that we're working with here, kubectl. So I'm going to use the control factor for the Kubernetes cluster, and it's going to leverage that file and the parameters as I mentioned earlier. But you'll notice when I actually paste this in here, I needed the name to be for an application. So I'm going to go ahead and change the name of the app. We'll call it Mike's Room. We're looking at the registry, so this is the registry that we worked with before for the container registry. The namespace that we had before, and just to verify. So it's more cluster, more is the namespace that we have. And then the app name that we deployed. So I'll validate the app name that I have. So as I mentioned earlier, this was actually going through scanning. So more rooms is my app name, and V1 is the tag. Now that I've completed that, I'll go ahead and hit the Enter key. So now I'm creating an application called Mike's Room, and I'm creating that application from the image registry that's out there from the image that I created and uploaded. Now that I have this out there, that image is out there running on that environment, but I need to be able to expose that. So when I ran it locally, I was using port 9080 on the local machine. Now I actually have to expose it on the internet. From here, I'm going to use another set of commands from the Quebectal selection. And I actually need to create a service for node port. So the app deploy name that I created was Mike's Room. And the node port is the type that we're exposing it. And then we're going to call this, and we're going to create a service. So I'll still call it Mike's Room. And you'll notice I have appended a dash service to that. This is just the name that we're using. Now, because of the internal port of 9080, I'm going to keep that because that's where it was exposed. And now it's actually created a service and exposed the internal port of 9080 to the outside-facing world. If I use the cube control describe service, I'll be able to see what the services are set up at. So in this service, you'll see the port that I was using on the internal. So here's the internal information, and here's the external port, 30450. So that'll be the information that I'll need when I'm actually deploying the service and exposing it. When you're accessing the application from the outside world, you need the access of the external port or the external IP address of your cluster, and then also looking at it from the deployment perspective of the port that you're exposing it on. So at this point, we'll go ahead and run the next command to describe the service itself. We've done that. We'll look at the BX container service workers. And in this case, the cluster name that we have, which is more clusters. And it'll give me the external IP address that we're using within this. So you'll notice it's public-facing IP address for the services that are there. So at this point, when I look at the information, I can actually go and copy this IP address. And we'll go back to a browser window. And we'll access it from the externally facing port. And we'll see that the room is now running. So what we've done so far is we've gone through, we've created the application, we've published the application into the container registry. In the container service, we've exposed that information. And now we've actually deployed that app and used a node port to expose it from that. The next piece to this is going to be exposing it in the game and making it accessible. And that'll be in the next session.